The storm rolled in with no warning. No drizzle. No gentle shift in wind. Just a sudden, violent bloom of black clouds rising over the Massachusetts coast, as if the heavens themselves had been torn open. The people of Newburyport knew storms well, hurricanes, nor'easters, the endless tantrums of the Atlantic. But this was different. The air pressed heavy, thick as cloth soaked in oil. Windows rattled in their frames. Candles guttered in church halls, though no draught could explain it. The harbor churned as if some vast creature thrashed beneath the surface, restless, impatient. And somewhere above those uneasy waters, a single room glowed. A garret chamber above the cooper's shop, where Samuel Hawthorne bent over his desk. His body hunched like a figure sculpted in wax, pale in the tremor of candlelight. Outside, lightning spidered across the sky, illuminating him for the briefest instants. His face sharp, eyes hollow, lips moving silently in words not meant for prayer. On the desk before him lay a journal, its pages already filled with frantic ink-blotted confessions. His hand trembled, but his strokes were purposeful, urgent, as though he feared his words might dissolve before they dried. He wrote of things no man should claim. "I am not of this earth," the ink proclaimed in jagged script. "You insist I was born here, but memory betrays me. I recall no cradle, no mother's hand, no soil beneath my feet that welcomed me as its own. I come from elsewhere, and elsewhere you cannot conceive." The candle flickered, and in the brief darkness that followed, he swore he felt eyes upon him. Not from the window, not from the door, but from the very walls, as though the timber beams themselves bent inward to watch. And yet, he continued, "I was sent here, or perhaps abandoned here. To observe? To suffer? I do not know. But the air sickens me. The hours twist into shapes they should not. The ground repels me. This world is wrong. And soon you will see it too." The storm cracked so violently that the desk shuddered beneath him. He signed the name with strokes that tore the page. Samuel Hawthorne. By dawn he would be gone. Some would say he vanished into the heart of the storm itself, body dissolved into rain and salt spray. Others would whisper that what remained of him was not wholly human. But what terrified the townsfolk most was not his disappearance. It was the gnawing question his words left behind. Had they been living all this time beside a creature wearing the skin of a man, one who claimed to be from another world? To understand Samuel Hawthorne's story, one must first step back into the cobbled, wind-battered streets of Newburyport, Massachusetts in the year 1837. Newburyport was no stranger to whispers of the uncanny. It stood at the edge of two worlds, one foot in Puritan austerity, the other in the rising hum of the industrial age. Its streets clung to the old ways, yet its harbor was alive with progress, filled with vessels carrying tea from China, molasses from the Caribbean, and news from ports far beyond the reach of New England superstition. The town was small, tight-knit, its buildings pressed together like anxious neighbors seeking comfort. Red brick warehouses loomed beside weather-beaten taverns, their signs creaking on rusted iron hooks. The smell of tar, smoke, and salt clung to every breath. At night, gas lamps hissed faintly on the main thoroughfares, but most alleys remained in darkness, lanes where cats prowled and sailors staggered home singing sea psalms that curdled into moans. The sea was the town's master. It gave and it took. Ships brought prosperity, but storms and wrecks could reduce whole families to poverty overnight. Coffins lined the cemetery rows like rows of teeth, many marked only with "lost at sea." Widows in black lace walked with measured grace, faces pale as though the salt winds had carved grief directly into their skin. And yet life moved forward. Blacksmiths hammered sparks into the dusk. Schoolchildren recited lessons in narrow classrooms. Ministers thundered from pulpits, voices shaking rafters with warnings of sin and damnation. But beneath it all, beneath the orderly prayers and honest work, there lay a marrow-deep unease. For this was New England, where memory stretched back not only to Pilgrims and Revolution, but also to witch trials and hauntings, to specters that once terrified Salem just a few towns away. The people here lived with one foot in reason, the other still planted in shadow. America in the 1830s was restless. The country was young, but its bones already creaked under strain. Expansion pressed westward. Industry smoldered in northern cities, while slavery chained millions in the South. Politicians brawled in Congress. The telegraph had just been demonstrated, promising to carry words faster than the fastest horse. Ideas moved quickly, too quickly for some. Mesmerism, phrenology, electricity, new sciences that blurred the line between miracle and fraud. Ordinary people stood on the edge of a precipice, staring into futures that felt both wondrous and terrifying. And in New England especially, the supernatural still walked hand in hand with these new sciences. Seances gathered in parlors. Spiritual magnets promised to heal the sick. Strange societies whispered about ancient civilizations, hidden dimensions, the thinness of the veil between this world and another. It was fertile ground for obsession, for men like Samuel Hawthorne to plant seeds of terror that would not easily be forgotten. Two institutions ruled Newburyport's daily life, the church and the harbor. The church remained the great watchman of morality. Ministers wielded power over not just souls but reputations. A whisper of heresy could ruin a man, leave him untouchable in business, unfit for marriage, cast out of polite society. Sermons spoke of a devil not as metaphor but as living presence. Storms, fires, and illness were not chance. They were warnings, punishments, or signs of darker bargains. The harbor was the town's lifeblood. Trade, whaling, and fishing provided the town with wealth, yet also brought sailors with foreign tales. Men returned from years at sea carrying scars and stories of monstrous waves, ghost lights, and creatures glimpsed under the black Atlantic. Those who listened too long to sailors' tales were thought foolish. Yet when storms tore ships apart, who could say the sea was not haunted? It was within this fragile balance, between superstition and progress, between faith and science, that Samuel Hawthorne appeared. The people of Newburyport were conditioned to believe in boundaries, between man and beast, between heaven and hell, between what belonged and what did not. But Hawthorne unsettled those boundaries. He carried knowledge that did not match his supposed origins, spoke words that unsettled the devout, and hinted at truths that neither minister nor professor could fully dismiss. And so, in this place of salt winds and iron faith, where the Atlantic beat endlessly against the shore, Samuel Hawthorne stepped into history. A stranger, a scholar, a man, or something wearing the shape of a man, who whispered that he was not of this world. And the people, who had been taught to fear both God and the storm, soon learned they had something far worse to fear, the possibility that he was telling the truth. Samuel Hawthorne entered Newburyport not with fanfare, but with silence. One spring morning in 1837 he was simply there. No one remembered the ship that brought him, nor the horse he rode, nor the family he claimed. One day he was absent from the town's story, and the next he was part of it, as though the tide had washed him in overnight, leaving him stranded like some pale relic on the shore. Those who later tried to describe him could not agree. Some recalled him as strikingly tall, his figure too elongated for comfort, shoulders narrow but upright with unnerving poise. Others insisted he was not so tall, only made taller by the severity of his bearing. His face, however, was remembered with unsettling clarity, skin pale as if touched too seldom by sunlight, cheekbones cut sharp enough to cast shadows, and eyes. Always the eyes. Witnesses struggled for the right words. Too large, said one. Too steady, said another. Some whispered they were the pale gray of storm water, others that they flickered with impossible colors when candlelight struck them. But most agreed on this: his gaze did not simply meet yours, it entered you. He looked not at a person but through them, as though measuring what lay behind the face, weighing it against some standard the rest of humanity did not know. He dressed plainly, in black coats and stiff collars, garments too somber even for a town accustomed to Puritan restraint. And yet, the simplicity only magnified his strangeness. There was no ornament, no softness, only a man who seemed carved from stark intent. If his appearance unsettled, his manner cemented it. Samuel Hawthorne did not move like other men. His steps were measured, almost deliberate, as though he were learning to imitate human gait. He seldom gestured. His hands remained still at his sides, save when he wrote or adjusted his spectacles, which he did with uncanny precision, fingers poised as if every motion had been rehearsed. His voice, however, captivated. Deep but not booming, it carried a resonance that seemed to fill a room without effort. Each word was carefully chosen, syllables shaped with a precision that betrayed long study. He spoke slowly not because he struggled for words, but because he seemed to savor them, testing the sound of human language as though it were both experiment and performance. To some, his voice was mesmerizing, carrying the weight of hidden knowledge. To others, it was suffocating, a presence that lingered in the ear long after he fell silent. It was not long before townsfolk realized Hawthorne's knowledge extended far beyond what his background should allow. He spoke of the stars with the confidence of an astronomer, yet he owned no telescope. He could describe the workings of the human body with precision that startled local physicians, though no record marked him as a doctor. He read Greek, Latin, and Hebrew with ease, and hinted that there were other languages, tongues not found in any book, that he had heard spoken in the places beyond. When asked where he had learned these things, he would only smile faintly and reply, "I remember what others have forgotten." He rarely spoke of his past, but when pressed, he gave answers that deepened suspicion rather than relieved it. He said he could not recall his mother's face. He said he had no memory of childhood games, no recollection of learning to walk or speak. His first clear memories, he claimed, were of wandering alone in a place of endless corridors and walls that breathed with light. To most, such claims sounded like madness or blasphemy. And yet, his composure was so steady, his logic so clear, that it was difficult to dismiss him outright. Children, it is said, were the first to sense something amiss. They whispered that Hawthorne never blinked, that he stood too still when he watched, that animals, dogs, horses, even cats, avoided him, recoiling with low growls or hissing when he passed. Merchants and sailors found him unsettling but harmless, until he began speaking of storms before they came, describing the color of the sky or the pitch of the wind hours before the weather turned. Some said he could predict which ships would not return, staring at the harbor with a mournful certainty that chilled even the most hardened captain. Ministers grew wary. His words were too bold, too comfortable with blasphemy. He did not argue against the existence of God, but spoke of him as though of a distant ruler, one sovereign among many. To the ministers, this was heresy, yet it was delivered with such calm conviction that their anger turned inward, gnawing at their own certainty. What unsettled the town most was not what Hawthorne said, but what he refused to say. When asked directly, "Who are you?" he would pause as though considering whether honesty was possible. Then he would reply softly, "I am here by accident." When asked from where he came, he would not name a country nor a town, but only murmur, "Not from here. Not from this place." And though his listeners laughed, or scolded, or tried to reason with him, the look in his eyes made it difficult to dismiss his words as folly. There was something in Hawthorne's presence that seemed borrowed, as though he wore humanity like a mask, convincing but not seamless. And as the weeks passed, as his words grew bolder and his experiments more visible, the people of Newburyport began to wonder if Samuel Hawthorne was not merely a man at all, but a trespasser from somewhere else. At first, Samuel Hawthorne was little more than a curiosity, a stranger whose words unsettled but did no tangible harm. But by the winter of 1838, his presence had shifted from curiosity to obsession. He no longer kept to himself. He began to gather. In the cramped chamber above the cooper's workshop, Hawthorne began inviting select townsfolk to what he called his evenings of revelation. He sent handwritten notes to those he deemed receptive minds, merchants, ministers, students, even widows with questions too heavy for the pulpit. The meetings began innocently. The lamps were dimmed, curtains drawn tight against the prying street. Hawthorne would speak in that steady, resonant voice, weaving scripture, astronomy, and folklore into something altogether stranger. He told them the earth was not what they believed, that its skies were but a veil, thin as glass, beneath which other worlds pressed their faces against the pane. He spoke of voices that threaded through dreams, of corridors in the sky where light did not behave as light should. He hinted that he himself had walked those corridors. At first the gatherings were crowded. Curiosity outweighed fear. But as weeks passed, the tone darkened. Some left visibly shaken, muttering prayers as they fled into the night. Others lingered, enthralled, desperate for the next lecture. One widow wrote in her diary, "He does not argue like a scholar, nor rant like a fanatic. He speaks as one remembering. And that is what chills me most, that the things he describes are not theories but recollections." By autumn, whispers of his experiments spread. Dockworkers reported seeing him carry crates of copper tubing, gears, polished lenses, and jars of strange fluids into an abandoned boathouse near the wharf. He worked by lamplight, the glow visible across the dark water. Soon the device took shape. No one could quite describe it. It seemed different each time they glimpsed it. Some said it was a great lantern, others a cage of brass and glass. But all agreed on one detail. When it operated, it produced a low hum that made the bones in one's chest vibrate, a sound that seemed less heard than felt. On one stormless night, fishermen swore they saw a column of light erupt from the machine, slicing through the sky. It was not lightning. It did not branch or fade. It was steady, unnatural, like a spear piercing heaven. The clouds above twisted around it as though resisting its intrusion. When townsfolk asked what he was doing, Hawthorne replied with unnerving calm, "I am preparing my return. When the veil thins, one must be ready to pass through." After the light, things began to happen. Dogs howled at empty air until their throats bled. Horses bolted at invisible threats, breaking harnesses, crashing wagons. Fishermen hauled nets of fish with cloudy, glassy eyes, creatures that thrashed as though alive but dissolved into pulp the moment they touched the air. A boy claimed he saw Hawthorne walking barefoot across the snow, leaving no footprints. An elderly woman insisted she heard his voice in her parlor, though he was miles away at the harbor. Some dismissed these as rumors, but then came the disappearances. Eliza Crow, a seamstress, vanished walking home from evening service. Matthew Blythe, a dockhand, was found 3 days later raving in the streets, eyes milk-white, screaming that the sky had shown him its hollow. Others were never seen again, their names spoken only in whispers at supper tables. Each disappearance coincided with storms. Sudden, violent, unnatural storms that seemed to rise whenever Hawthorne's device was said to glow. The town split in two. Some believed Hawthorne a heretic, perhaps even possessed. Ministers thundered from pulpits that he was in league with Satan, and parishioners spat his name like a curse. Others defended him, claiming he was a man of science, pushing the boundaries of knowledge where weak men dared not tread. They argued that he was not wicked but enlightened, that his strangeness was proof of genius. But beneath both sides lay fear. Even those who denounced him could not quite dismiss him. And those who defended him often did so with trembling voices, as though trying to convince themselves as much as others. Then, in February of 1839, Samuel Hawthorne announced his intention. He would no longer merely speak of his origin, he would prove it. Handwritten notices appeared on doorsteps, sealed with red wax in the shape of a spiral. The message was brief. You doubt. You fear. You question. Come and see. The door opens on the 12th night. And so, despite their dread, dozens came. Ministers, skeptics, sailors, widows. They gathered in the abandoned meeting hall at the edge of town, where storms rattled the windows and Hawthorne's machine stood waiting, its copper veins humming like a living heart. None of them knew that by the end of that night, they would question not only who Samuel Hawthorne was, but what they were. March of 1839 arrived heavy and strange. The air itself seemed charged, as if the town lived beneath the skin of a thundercloud that never broke. On the 12th night, just as his invitation had promised, Samuel Hawthorne summoned them. The old meeting hall on Mill Street groaned in the storm's grip. Wind clawed at the shutters, rain lashed the roof like drumbeats of war. Yet still they came, merchants in fine coats, widows with shawls clutched tight, ministers holding trembling Bibles. Fear had not kept them away. Curiosity had dragged them here by the throat. And at the front of the hall stood the machine. It filled the room like a living thing, brass ribs, copper veins, and glass chambers glowing faintly as if lit from within by a second sun. The low hum it gave off vibrated in every rib cage, turning each heartbeat into an echo. Then Samuel entered. Dressed in black, rain streaming from his shoulders, he smiled as if welcoming guests to a feast. "Tonight," he said, his voice steady despite the storm's roar, "the veil opens. Tonight you shall see that death is but a door, and I have the key." He moved to the machine with a reverence that was almost worship. With a turn of a crank, the hum deepened. With the pulling of a lever, the glass chambers filled with a blue, unnatural light. The storm outside screamed louder, as though the sky itself were resisting. And then the first sound came, deep, rolling like an ocean beneath the floorboards. The audience shifted uneasily, glancing around, unsure whether the sound came from the storm, the machine, or the earth itself. Samuel spread his arms. "Do not fear. It is only the knocking of those who wait to be remembered." The machine blazed. A column of light surged upward, tearing through the hall's rafters, through the storm and into the heavens. But it was not mere light. It was a hole, a wound in the sky itself. Through it, the townsfolk saw what no human was meant to see. The stars twisted like eyes turning in sockets. Vast shadows moved behind them, shapes so enormous they dwarfed the imagination. One woman swore she saw a hand of bone stretching down across the night, its fingers brushing the clouds. Another cried out that the stars were not stars at all, but windows, and something watched from each one. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the room were filling with the breath of 1,000 unseen lungs. And then came the voices. At first they were whispers, Samuel's name repeated softly, endlessly, in tones that were neither male nor female. Then the whispers became words, not in English but in a language older than stone. Every person in the hall heard it differently, some as hymns, others as screams, but all understood one thing: the voices were calling. Several fell to their knees, weeping. One man tore at his own ears until blood ran down his jaw. Another rushed the door, but when he touched the handle, the wood dissolved into ash beneath his hand. The machine pulsed and the world shifted. For a heartbeat, the walls melted away and the hall became something else. An endless corridor of black stone, lined with doors that had no hinges, no locks, only carvings of spirals. Something vast moved in the distance, dragging chains that sparked against the ground. When the hall snapped back into itself, half the oil lamps had gone out. And at the center, Samuel stood transformed. His eyes were no longer human. They glowed faintly like lanterns held behind thin skin. His voice, when he spoke, was layered, his own words buried beneath others as though he were a mouthpiece for a choir of the dead. "I told you," he intoned, "I am not of here. I came through once as a child. I return now as a herald. The door does not open for all, only for those willing to be unmade." As he spoke, the machine's glass chambers began to fill not with light, but with figures. Faces pressed against the glass from within. Faces of the missing townsfolk, pale and distorted, mouths opening in endless, soundless screams. The ministers tried to recite prayers, but their words curdled in their mouths, syllables turning backwards as if the very air rejected them. Then the machine faltered. Sparks burst from its gears. The column of light shivered, bending as though something on the other side were pulling it wider. The townsfolk screamed as shadows poured into the hall, arms too long, heads that never stopped turning, shapes that seemed to exist only when not directly looked at. The building groaned, its timbers cracking. One by one, people vanished into the light, not walking, not pulled, but simply ceasing to exist as if they had never been born. Samuel did not resist. He raised his arms and stepped into the light with a look of rapture. His body bent, stretched, dissolved into something unrecognizable, and then was gone. The machine screamed, metal shrieking like a dying animal. Then, with a final burst of light, it collapsed inward, imploding rather than breaking, until nothing remained but scorched wood and silence. When dawn came, the storm had vanished. The meeting hall stood empty, save for a black spiral scorched into the floor. Of the dozens who entered that night, only 5 stumbled out alive. Their hair had gone white, their eyes unfocused, their words broken. None ever spoke clearly of what they saw again. And Samuel Hawthorne? His name was struck from the church records. His house was abandoned, his possessions burned. The town swore never to speak of him again. But the spiral remained. And sometimes, on stormless nights, the fishermen at the harbor swear they see a column of light, thin, steady, and patient, piercing the heavens once more. At dawn, the storm broke into a silence that felt wrong. Not peaceful, hollow. The air smelled scorched, as though lightning had lingered too long in one place. When the first townsfolk dared to step into Mill Street, they found the meeting hall unrecognizable. The shutters were gone. The roof sagged. Every window pane had shattered outward, glass sprayed across the street like frost. But the strangest mark was on the floor, a great spiral, blackened into the planks, burned so deep the timber smoldered though no fire had spread. And there was no sign of Samuel Hawthorne. No body. No machine. Only silence. 5 figures wandered into daylight, stumbling like drunks though they had not touched drink. Their eyes were pale, clouded, unable or unwilling to focus. The sheriff, Joseph Silsby, caught one by the shoulders and demanded answers. What happened in there? Where are the others? The man only muttered a phrase again and again in a voice not his own. Doors within doors, doors within doors. Another survivor collapsed in the mud, clutching her ears, whispering in a child's sing-song. He went home. He went home. He went home. Of the 5, none gave a straight account. Their minds were shattered vessels. And yet all of them carried the same mark, a faint ring of bruising around the throat as if unseen hands had pressed there during the night. Panic swept Newburyport. Families stormed the hall looking for loved ones. Sons, wives, fathers who had gone to witness Hawthorne's demonstration. None were found. In total, 31 townsfolk vanished that night. The sheriff called for order, but whispers spread faster than law. Some swore the missing had been taken by spirits. Others said they had been swallowed by the devil himself. But one rumor echoed louder than the rest. Samuel Hawthorne had not died. He had crossed over. The ministers moved quickly to seize control of the story. The Reverend Nathaniel Boardman delivered a sermon the following Sabbath, voice trembling as he thundered. This was no man of God, but a wolf in human skin. He trafficked in forbidden arts, and the Almighty struck him down. Speak not his name, for to remember him is to invite him back. The congregation nodded, but many eyes darted nervously to the church rafters, as if expecting them to splinter under unseen weight. The church elders ordered Samuel's journals and letters seized. His rented rooms above the cooper's shop were emptied, the pages burned in the square for all to see. But not every paper was destroyed. Whispers claimed a constable slipped away with a sheaf of notes, sketches of spirals, star maps, and a script no one could read. Sheriff Silsby declared an inquiry. But how do you investigate something that bends reality itself? He interviewed the survivors, yet their stories dissolved into contradictions. One swore Samuel had transformed into light. Another insisted his body split into 1,000 crows. A third claimed Hawthorne was still in the hall, standing in the center of the spiral, smiling, when the rest of the world collapsed around him. The sheriff wrote in his log, "I cannot press them further. Each time they recall, their health declines. One bled from the nose. One convulsed. It is as if the memory itself poisons them." No arrests were made. No trial was held. The law had no language for what had happened. But silence is its own poison. Families of the missing grew restless. Rumors spread through taverns that Samuel had not died but lived among them in disguise, that he had built another machine in the woods, that the storm would return when the spiral was ripe. Fishermen claimed to see strange lights at sea, columns rising straight from the water into the clouds. A schoolteacher found her chalkboard covered overnight in spirals she had not drawn. Horses refused to pass the meeting hall at night, their bodies stiff, eyes rolling with terror. The town tried to bury it, but the earth refused to keep the body downed up. Midsummer, whispers of the event had reached Salem, even Boston. Scholars arrived, carrying notebooks and questions. They examined the spiral burned into the hall's floor. One insisted it resembled markings in an Arabic grimoire he had once glimpsed in Paris. Another called it a gate, though he would not explain gate to what. The locals resented their intrusion. They barred the doors, forbade photographs, even tore out the section of the floorboards and burned them at the edge of town. But still the scholars lingered, listening to fishermen's tales and gathering rumors like crows gathering bone. By winter, Newburyport declared the event a fire. 31 deaths were written as perished by accident. Samuel's name was stricken from all official records, church and state alike. But the truth had already escaped into whispers, carried from mouth to ear, tavern to ship, ship to port. And within a decade, tales of Samuel Hawthorne, the man from another world, had become a sailor's legend, retold on stormy nights when the sea itself seemed alive. In the months that followed, Newburyport carried on as if nothing had happened. Ships still sailed. Children still played on cobbled streets. Church bells still tolled each Sabbath. But beneath that rhythm the scars ran deep. Families of the missing left black-draped windows for years. Mothers wandered the shoreline calling names that would never be answered. Some townsfolk swore they still heard the vanished walking upstairs at night, boots crossing floorboards, doors opening and closing, though their homes were empty. The meeting hall was torn down within a year. The ground beneath it was salted, then fenced off. Yet the spiral would not fade. Farmers claimed that even after the earth was plowed and seeded, crops bent in unnatural curves, as though bowing to an unseen design. By the 1840s, Samuel Hawthorne's story was no longer spoken openly, but in hushed tones. What sailors muttered over rum in storm-tossed harbors, what children dared each other to whisper near the ruins on Mill Street. They said Hawthorne had not perished but ascended, returned to a place beyond the stars. Some claimed he had been a messenger. Others called him a thief of souls. And then there were those who whispered that he had been sent back, not to leave this world, but to prepare it. When the Great Fire of 1846 swept through Newburyport, destroying hundreds of buildings, some claimed it was no accident. Witnesses insisted that before the flames consumed the city, a column of blue light pierced the night sky, just as it had the night Hawthorne vanished. The clergy denounced such stories as blasphemy. But survivors swore the fire moved unnaturally, circling around the old site of the meeting hall before spreading outward. And when the ashes cooled, the spiral burned itself into the cobblestones once more. In Boston, scholars collected fragments of Hawthorne's surviving notes, copied in secret before the church destroyed them. These fragments hinted at something larger. Calculations of planetary alignments. Sketches of doors carved into stone walls, always spiraled. References to voices that promised him return. One fragment, preserved in the private collection of a Harvard astronomer, read simply, "I did not come alone. I was only the first to remember." The fragment never appeared in public. The astronomer's descendants destroyed it after his death, insisting he had lost his mind staring at the night sky. Stranger still, Newburyport was not the last place touched by Samuel's shadow. In 1861, a whaling ship vanished off Greenland. The few survivors claimed they had seen a man in black standing on the ice, smiling as the aurora spiraled above him. In 1874, a small congregation in Maine disappeared during an evening service. The only survivor, a child, claimed a door of light had opened behind the altar, and the minister had walked willingly into it. Each time, witnesses whispered the same word, Hawthorne. By the turn of the 20th century, Newburyport had embraced silence as survival. The town no longer spoke his name. Schoolteachers skipped over that year in their lessons. The site of the old meeting hall was paved over, turned into a warehouse, then later a parking lot. But silence does not bury the past. It preserves it. Fishermen still claim to see lights at sea on moonless nights. The spiral still etches itself into frost on windows each winter. And some families, descendants of those who vanished, still wake screaming, saying they hear Samuel's voice calling from the stairwell. What Samuel Hawthorne revealed, whether by madness, invention, or something darker, was that the world was not as sealed as people believed. That there were doors in the fabric of reality, thin places where one could listen, and sometimes step through. The institutions that defined the 19th century, church, state, law, all failed to contain him. The church burned his writings. The law wrote him out of record. The town swore an oath of silence. But the legacy endured. Because even now, nearly 2 centuries later, we are still left with the same terrible question Hawthorne forced his neighbors to face. What if the man beside you is not truly of this world? History insists Samuel Hawthorne never lived. His name was erased from church records, his journals burned, his neighbors sworn to silence. The town of Newburyport chose forgetting over remembering, silence over truth. But silence is never empty. It echoes, it festers, and it waits, because no matter how carefully his story was buried, fragments have slipped through, tales whispered in taverns, strange lights at sea, spirals carved by unseen hands. A century and a half has passed, yet his shadow lingers, stretching across generations like a hand that refuses to unclench. Samuel claimed he was not of this world, that he had crossed a threshold, and that he had only been the first to remember. If that was madness, then it was madness shared by dozens of witnesses who never returned home. If it was truth, then what does that mean for the rest of us? We spend our lives believing the world is solid, safe, unmoving, that the floorboards beneath our feet will hold, that the night sky is only stars. But what if Hawthorne was right? What if there are doors, thin, silent, waiting, and sometimes one of them opens? And what if someone steps through? Was Samuel Hawthorne a heretic, a genius, a lunatic, or the herald of something still to come? That question is not mine to answer. It is yours. Tell me, what do you believe? Was he mad, or was he truly not of this earth? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you felt the weight of this story, share it, let it spread, and subscribe for more histories they tried to erase. Because the past is never dead. It waits. And sometimes, it knocks.